Hi and welcome to Mailbox number 30, and the first one is actually from Twitter. Someone tweeted this. I've seen it doing the rounds a little bit more as well. It says, if you thought the idea of gnome paladins was bad, and then this, it's like, that's not bad. That would actually be amazing. In fact, I'm not suggesting as playable paladin race, but if the pug pet, you know, could have this sort of suit with it, or if they made a pug pet with the Lightbringer armor, that would be adorable. I would absolutely have that following me around everywhere. I think this is fantastic. Thanks very much to whoever produced it. Blizzard, come on, make that pet. Make that pet. I will buy that pet. So on to the YouTube comments. So, first one, relate to Classic. So, why do you only talk about raiding? First question, I like raiding. I very much like raiding. In fact, if I didn't like the raiding in WoW as much as I do, I wouldn't play WoW as much as I do. It says, especially in Classic WoW, we had no raids at the beginning. Well, you had to level up anyway. It took me ages to level up. It made no difference what there was at the beginning. It says, why some like myself want Classic WoW back is because the game we knew died after Burning Crusade come out, blah, 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 blah. It says, and even further when Cataclysm came around the corner. Well, I certainly didn't like the revamps of the Cataclysm stuff and the old stuff. So the thing about PvE is that leveling is part of that, if not the base of it all. No, leveling, you can enjoy the leveling, you can enjoy the quest, you can enjoy learning about all the different things. That's what I actually thought was really good about the 1 to 60 content in Vanilla, which was completely destroyed by the Cataclysm. It was very aptly named, that expansion, because you learnt about a lot of things about the game. And so that was quite good, you know. That could be a game in itself. But really, leveling up is an advanced tutorial for the end game in a game such as this, because it's there to teach you about the world you're in, it's there to teach you about important characters, it's there to teach you how to play the class. You get portioned out abilities a bit at a time, so you become proficient with them all, rather than getting lumped all in one go. But ultimately, it's preparing you for the end. The stories are more interested when they're related to raids and dungeons. The gameplay is more interesting when you work in as part of a larger group to defeat more complex bosses and encounters. So everything leads up to that. But the reason why I talk about raiding is quite simply because it's the best part of WoW. Then it says here, I'm going to have to call you out on this one. It depends what you're playing, of course. So it did have a lot of limitation back in the day, of course, indeed. It says you weren't going to solo hog it unless you are 5 levels higher and got the gear too. Nonsense. I soloed it on my Paladin as soon as I came across it. And I was in crap gear. In fact, I knew so little about gear that I was buying white quality gear from vendors, like in Stormwind and places like that. At the time, it would have been Goldshire. And so no, I mean, on certain classes it would be. I will grant you, when I first played a Warlock and before I really knew what I was doing, I actually used to die on it at low levels. It was like, what am I doing wrong? And then I left the Warlock alone for a little bit, and I was playing my Paladin, which was level capped at the time. And there was a Warlock I used to play with, and I thought, what should we do? And then when I went back on it again, all of a sudden I suddenly knew more about the game and didn't die on it as much. So there were some classes that may have struggled. Paladin, not at all. Not at all. And then there was the last comment here. It says, it's just that 99% of the players who want Classic back don't care about raiding at all. Now, this is exactly the sort of thinking that had Blizzard say, you think you do, but you won't. It's classic, if you'll pardon the pun, thinking of that everyone has the same view as you. You don't like raiding. You know some other people who don't like raiding. Therefore, you think nobody likes raiding. Okay? Because that's what, say, 99% is. That's what people who say 99%, have they conducted an extensive survey and found 99% think that? No. What they're basically saying is, nobody thinks this way, but we know that 1 or 2 people will, so we'll just say 99% instead of 100%. That's the classic thing there. We don't know that at all. We have no idea. We can't tell anything about this until it actually comes out and people are doing stuff. But to come back to the first one, the simple reason I talk a lot about raiding, and when I talk about anything in the game, I come at it from the point of view of raiding, is because for me, that is the ultimate goal of the game. That's the natural path. Now, some people don't want to carry on that full path. They want to stop at certain points. They just want to enjoy where they are. They find a nice little park bench on the journey and just sit there and raid. But, you know, if you keep going down the path, ultimately raiding is where it leads to. Next question. It says, the game has changed for the better in every expansion. Legion began being the best one to date with Mop right after. In which case it can't have been better every expansion because there's an expansion between them and you know which one that is. It says, I have enjoyed every expansion, I have to say. And with every expansion, you clearly see how much worse Classic was. I believe that Blizzard's decision to make the Classic announcement was the dumbest thing they could ever have done. I would disagree with that, even if I didn't like Classic myself, which I do, and I'm not going to. People keep asking me how I'm going to go into it. I'll create a character, and I'll create my old character, and I'll potter about in it. I'm not going to go in it full time. I'm not someone who doesn't like. If I didn't like the current game, I wouldn't be playing it as much as I do. And I think some things have improved. I think some things haven't. But even if I really didn't care about it at all, I would not think it's silly for Blizzard to do it. In fact, I think it's silly for them not to do it. And I've said this before. I think it was daft of them not to have brought it out before. It's like if you have a product that's very popular and you choose not to sell it, what are people going to do? They're going to make copies themselves. That's why the private servers... Well, it's one reason why the private servers existed. Got to bear in mind, private servers existed even when vanilla was out. So there are other reasons as well. But, a lot of the people on these things, it's because that product is not available to them. Blizzard have it, and they're not selling it. That's silly. That's a silly business decision. So it absolutely makes sense for them to do it. It doesn't require a lot. They get a separate... They've already said they're getting another team in to do it, which is what I said they should do anyway. It wouldn't need to be a large team. People keep overstating how much is required. If a few people can do it on a private server, then Blizzard can easily just get a few people to do it as well. And without ever the sword of Damocles over people of, oh, the plug might be pulled on this. No, it won't be. It'll be something that is properly supported. All Blizzard have to do is decide what their business model for it is, as well as, there are a few things they'll have to consider, because what some people want out of a Classic server, other people don't. There's going to be a lot of conflicting things. The way it's been pitched at the moment, I think this is Blizzard's main problem, is there's a lot of people who think they're all on the same side because they want Classic servers. Blizzard have said they're going to get Classic servers, and everyone thinks it's the same thing. But it's not. There's everyone, when you pin it down to what's actually going to be released, there'll be some people who want those Classic servers bringing out and evolving over time, replicating the way it was previously. There'll be people who want it just to come out with everything there, and they'll work their way through it as it is. Certain events, like we're talking before about the opening of the AQ gates, will they do that? Will people want to do it? When they've done it, then it's done on that server as well. So anyone that joins the party later has missed that out. When do they do that? Do they do it a year after the Classic servers launch? And then what? What happens to the Classic servers 2 years after it's come out? Do they start again? That doesn't make sense, because people don't want that. People will want their characters to be there. How do you evolve? Do you allow people to migrate their character to another server or something like that, where it starts again? And what happens to their gear? Do you just bring out, every 2 years, do you just bring out another Classic server so people can start the whole treadmill again? There's a lot of questions in there, and people will have very different views about what they are. But one thing that's absolutely guaranteed is that all these people who think that everyone wants the same thing as them, they don't. They all want a different vision of a Classic server. And that's the big issue that they have. And I'm sure that that's one of the big things that has put them off in the past. The whole objection to Classic servers that Blizzard had right from the start, I am absolutely certain, is as a result of all these mind-bending questions that they'd have to answer. God, my voice is going. Next one. Oh yeah, this to do with Antorus. It says, why can't multi-dotters have bad single target? Why does Blizzard favour Warlocks so much? Well, in terms of the Warlocks thing, I think they have made a bit of a mistake. See, I don't think they do favour Warlocks, because if they did, they'd always be at the top. With Warlocks, it's like any pure DPS class. They're always going to be really strong. And the reason for that is because they've got access to multiple specs. So, one spec might be super good against a single target boss, but it might not be very good when there's ads about. But then there's probably going to be a spec where it's really good when there's lots of ads about. and there might be another one that's just really good for high mobility. So, or lots of target switching, whatever you want to look at it as. I think where there has been an issue with Warlocks is that it's a single spec that's been really strong in so many situations. So Affliction has been the one. You can have played Affliction throughout Legion, no problem at all. Usually you would expect in a serious guild, raiding guild, that a pure DPS class, you would expect them to be proficient with at least 2 of the specs and be able to switch between them. And there's no reason why not 3 in Legion, because we don't have dual spec anymore. We can just switch between all of them. But you know, Warlocks have been able to do it just as Affliction. There's been a couple of fights where maybe one of the others has been a shade better, but not enough to the point where it's worth getting all that gear and AP on the second one. So you can quite happily just be an expert Affliction Warlock and be on every boss and be strong. The same has not been true of the other 2. But in general, now in terms of the actual question, why can't multi-dotters have poor single target? If that was just aimed at Affliction Warlocks, then absolutely they could, as long as one of the other specs allows them to be good at single target, because they just switch to that. However, there are other multi-dotters as well, Shadow Priest, Boomkins, for example, where they basically only have that one. Shadow Priests only have 1 DPS spec. You can't really punish them like that. It's not very fair. There's plenty of raid bosses in any tier that needs a single target focus, and you're basically saying that they shouldn't be brought along. That's not fair. So you can't have that situation. All you can really do, if you want to balance it at all, is to make sure that multi-dotting doesn't give you such an outrageous DPS benefit. And there are a couple of ways to do that. I mean, I talked about last week is, you know, if they were just... I'm not saying that I think they should do this, by the way, but one thing they could do is just not have multi-dotted. They could easily eliminate that from the game. Some people were saying, oh yeah, but then that would make these specs really weak. No, it wouldn't, because those specs would be redesigned to bear that in mind. Other things would be buffed in their place. But now you might say it'd be boring. Well, that's a different matter. Again, a redesign of the class might deal with that as well. But yeah, you can't just say, oh, you know, for any class or spec, you can't just say, okay, you can be really good at this fight, but you're going to be terrible at others, because then you're asking them to just be brought along for a couple of fights and bench for the rest. And that's not fair. I'm a firm believer, even though Blizzard aren't anymore, they've long abandoned this maxim that you should bring the player, not the class. And when you can't do that, that is and I think the reason Blizzard have abandoned it just out of laziness, because it is a failure on the class design's part if you can't do that. So it used to be an ambition. I don't think it was ever fully realised, but it used to be a key aim of the design team to achieve this, which meant that they always did better than they do now, where they've completely abandoned that aim. You know, with Legion, we've had the game director first of all say that they don't care about bring the player, not the class. They don't care about that, and even to say, he's actually said in a live Q&A, where he asked the question, is balance even important? And he wasn't asking it a rhetorical way. He was actually asking it as if it's an actual question. No, it's not an actual question. Of course it's important. All right? Whether you can fully achieve it is another matter. But the fact that they don't care about that, we'll have to see what happens with the class design team in BFA. Next question. It says, the fact you have to put your gear through a third-party simulation outside of the game, no matter how big an eye-level upgrade, is silly. It is, isn't it? It is difficult from Blizzard's point of view, granted, because the easiest way to guarantee that an item level upgrade is an actual upgrade is to basically just not have different stats. You know, you could have your primary stat, which does some things, and you could have a single secondary stat, call it mastery, whatever it happens to be. In which case, if every single piece had the same stats on them, but just different numbers, then obviously the higher numbers would always win out. The fact that Blizzard have different numbers, like you've got various secondary stats on them, is what causes the issue. But people do, I mean, this is something that Blizzard are very keen to keep. And it's also something, to be fair, that a lot of players are. A lot of players would not like to go along to a boring set of stats. So this is sort of the price we pay. The price we pay is that item level is not a guaranteed upgrade. Now, Blizzard did sort of say, I mean, it was completely out of whack at the start of Legion, and then it got a bit better, They tackled it, especially with the rings and necks. And what they said is that 10 item levels should, in most cases, be an upgrade. I'm not really sure it is. That's the problem. There's other things that have thrown it out of whack as well. Obviously, traits on a relic cause problems. I mean, the Netherlight Crucible has not helped one iota in that regard. You know, having legendaries again is also an awkward one, because even if everything else was the same, how would you judge without using simulations or anything else which legendaries would be best in certain situations? Obviously, legendaries are going for the next expansion, but secondary stats are not. So I think it's just one of those things. It's a price we have to pay. What is quite good is that there are easy ways to do it now. Raidbots does make for a much easier interface for Simcraft. So there is a relatively straightforward way of us simulating it now. But yeah, I mean, it's the price we pay for having so many different stats. And if we want those different stats, we want that different gameplay, then that's what we're going to have to put up with. And even if they brought Reforging back, it would still be an issue. It would just be less of an issue, which is why I think they should bring Reforging back. But they're really adamant they're not going to. Next one, it says, to all the people that keep crying about AP and Concordance ranks, with 11 out of 11 Mythic cleared, it's proven the instance is tuned with 75 traits in mind. Ian said there will be no more raids in Legion. No, he didn't. He was specifically asked, will there be more raids in Legion? And he didn't say no. What he said was there will be no more major raid tiers. He was very specific about his words. He said there'll be no more major raid tier. And he said there would be no more Ruby Sanctum type raid. So what he's saying is there isn't going to be a raid with like 10 bosses and a raid tier with it. There isn't going to be a raid with like a boss in it. Doesn't stop there being a raid with 3 to 5 bosses in it. And in fact, it's the AP thing that's just been data mined that strongly suggests, if not proves, that there is going to be another raid coming out. Or there's going to be some significant piece of content coming out. We cannot behave like Antorus is the peak of Legion. It's the end of the Legion story, but it's not the first expansion. It won't be the last, where the end story of the expansion doesn't coincide with the end of the expansion, right? Burning Crusade, for example, the expansion's content did not end when we defeated Illidan. So there has been the odd one. I mean, most expansions surely it does. Although that has usually been because we've then been exposed to a year-long content drought, which was not the case in TBC, and presumably is not going to be the case in Legion. So the other thing is, so what was Dataman, for those who don't know, is at the moment you can get up to 50 Concordance points on your artifact. So you get all your traits, I can't even remember how many that is now, and then you've got the Concordance points, which you just click in the same one. And you can get up to 50 of those, except you realistically can't, because the amount of AP required to get 50 is not actually obtainable with our artifact level, or artifact knowledge, sorry, stuck at 55. So what's been data mined is that the number of ranks is going to increase to 100. Well, if 50 was impossible to get to, how are we going to get to 100? We're not, unless something's going to change. So something's going to change. Simple as that. We're going to be getting more artifact knowledge at some point, you would think. There's also going to be a reason for wanting more Concordance ranks, because at the moment, it's not worth it, right? It's really not worth it. So you've got to think, what are they building us up for? Given that you've just said there, Blizzard have demonstrated that, you know, Antorus is tuned for 75 traits. What on earth are we going to need more for then? More content, another raid. Simple as that. But more of a Trial of Valor type raid than an Antorus type raid. That's simple as that. Next question. It says, isn't the weekly upgrade of our Pantheon trinkets, when you say our Pantheon trinkets, it's not actually our Pantheon trinkets. Some of us don't have a Pantheon trinket. Isn't the weekly upgrade of our Pantheon trinkets a slow nerf to Antorus? Yes and no. Only in the same way that gear in general is. The fact is, this always used to be the way that content was nerfed. It's with the fact that you get more gear each week. So by the time most guilds defeat Mythic Argus, they're going to have a higher item level than, say, Mythod and Exorcist did when they defeated it. Because we'll have farmed so much since then. Also, if it's the case with the other tier raids, halfway through, we're going to get another boost from something else. Something else will give us a boost, possibly connected with the extra ranks of Concordance that are being laid out. So that might mean our artifact hasn't finished growing in power yet. But the actual Pantheon trinkets are powerful enough to annoy people who are not happy about the way they're dropping, because of course it's so RNG that, you know, I might not go on for 3 months, for example, the way it is working out. Whereas a lot of people already have them. You can be way behind and losing out on a lot of power through no fault of your own. You're killing Argus every week on some mode or other, and you're just not getting it. But let's say people did have it. Is it a slow nerf to Antorus? No, it's only in the way, as I say, that gear increases. And is it a much bigger effect? I don't know, because again, it does depend on how many of them you can get in your raid. You know, and you would expect guilds and raids that have been farming Argus from the first week to have more of them after a certain amount of time, but not necessarily everyone. So they are. You would still. I mean, Blizzard don't. I don't think they plan to nerf certain bosses. I think what they just wait is for a bit of a bottleneck. Sometimes I think they do it a bit too quickly. Sometimes not. But what they do is they identify. Okay, there's a lot of guilds stuck at this boss. We'll just nerf it now, and then ease the flow, and then if at another point another boss looks like it's causing a bit of a backlog, then they'll nerf that at that point as well. So it's very reactive the way they nerf these bosses anyway. Next one. Oh, the Postmaster thing. See, I like this idea of the Postmaster minigame. So those who are not aware, it's a minigame coming to 7.3.5 where there's like all the 7 continents. It doesn't include Draenor as in alternate Draenor, but it's like, let me try and get these right this time. Eastern Kingdoms, Kalimdor, the 2 main continents. But then you've got Northrend, I think Pandaria is in there as well. You've got Outland, you've got the Broken Isles, and something else that I'm forgetting, because I think there's 7. Or maybe there's 6. Okay, maybe there are 6. But whatever it is, so there's the different continents, the different land masses. And then you get a letter to a place, and you've got to know which continent that place is in, and quickly chuck it into the right chute. And it's just a little mini game. But if you can do 30 of these in 60 seconds, you get a special title, Postmaster. Now, someone's saying here, someone will just make an add-on for the Postmaster thing. I do hope not. I think that would be disappointing, because I think it sounds fun. It's a bit like I was doing when I just stream me pottering around doing world quests, and I do the Barrels of Fun thing, and people just say, oh, there's an add-on for that. It's like, it makes it boring then. There's no interest. Right, the only one of the Kirin Tor world quests I really don't like is the Magic of Flight one, I think it's called, where you had to do all that falling and jumping on crystals and stuff like that. That was a lot of nonsense. I'm deeply glad that flying has completely eliminated the need to mess about with that one. But all the others have actually been quite fun, I think. So, yeah, I certainly would not get an add-on for that, and I would think it would be disappointing if people did. But you are quite right, it could well be the sort of thing, unless Blizzard can be cunning, because I'd be quite sure that Blizzard would try and avoid people being able to make an add-on for it. But, you know, if people do and it can, but that would be disappointing, I think. Next one, it says, just goes that there are too many classes and specs to balance the game. And there are, I think it's a good point. When I think about other MMOs, they don't have as many classes as WoW, as far as I can tell. I haven't, of course, played every other MMO. What is notable is, I think, a couple of things. First of all, yeah, when you've got so many classes, obviously each class needs its own thing. And Blizzard, I think they've not done themselves any favours in Legion, because they've also wanted to see each individual spec having its own thing. Well, the problem with that is you compound your problem. You go from a problem of needing 12 unique identities to 36. That's a huge problem. That is a big old problem, which is going to cause casualties, as it has. But yeah, when I think back to other games, it's like they don't, do they? A lot of MMOs don't have many classes. I mean, ESO, which I play, has like 5 classes. Star Wars: The Old Republic. I mean, it's a bit of a weird one, that one, I suppose, isn't it? It's got 4 main classes, but each class is sort of split into 2 for each faction. I mean, but they have different ones on different factions as well. So for a given faction, that's the choice there. You know. I mean, there are some MMOs that also, I think, have too many. But yeah, 12 is a hell of a lot, isn't it? It is a hell of a lot. And I think, I mean, the problem has been caused by the fact that you started off with a lot of classes. The game started off with a lot of classes. And maybe it shouldn't have done. But they also had this attitude that every couple of expansions there should be a new class. So with Wrath of the Lich King, we got the new class of Death Knight, and then a couple of expansions later we got Monks, and then a couple of expansions later we've got Demon Hunters. So we've added to the pool. Now, if they always sort of... I mean, I know they didn't know long-term what was going to happen with the game. They keep talking about the fact they didn't even know there'd be an expansion to it. They had no idea how successful it was. I'm not sure I buy that. If you're going to put 4 years of development into this thing or whatever it was, then you're going to sort of expect that there's going to be at least an expansion. But I don't know what... Obviously, I don't know what their long-term plans at the time were, but... And I can understand them not thinking it would go on for as long as it has. But maybe they shouldn't have just had as many classes as they did at the start. Because that created a huge problem in itself. But they did, and it is as it is. And I think you are quite right that there are too many classes. And I think they really need to start simplifying it down. And start to think in terms of class identity instead of spec identity for a start. In the way that it used to be. I mean, what has separated out the different specs is the talent system that was brought in for MOP. I think that's where a lot of the problem has come. So, for example, I mean, I spit as a Paladin. Different Paladin specs have different abilities. There are some abilities that, you know, Holy Paladins have that Protection and Retribution Paladins don't have. And I'm not talking about their healing spells, obviously. So, you know, maybe they need to think more about class identity instead of spec identity a bit more. Because even though they talk about class fantasy, there's so much where they've tried to come up with... Like, the Hunters is a classic case, isn't it? One criticism that was levelled at Hunters in the past few years is all the specs basically played the same. Marksman, Beastmaster, and Survival all basically played the same. They had different abilities, but you could almost map on them in the equivalent slots and use almost the same rotation for each one. It would just have different icons and do slightly different things, but not a lot. And I think that was one criticism of that. So they came up with the very different... And they have, I think they've been successful with Hunters. They've all got their own different identities. But the cost of that is, that means there's 3 unique things they need to do instead of just 1, with a few variations between the different specs. You know, it would be better, I think, in retrospect, if there were not lots of different specs. I mean, probably Blizzard are a bit screwed on that one. But if it was just the case that you had each individual class and you only had different specs where they were for a different role. So, you know, Paladins would have 3 because, you know, the melee DPS, the healer, and the tank. Druids possibly still 4 because you distinguish between melee DPS and range DPS. But say Warlock or Mage, there's a Warlock. What do you want? There's a Warlock. You vary the way they play with the talent system. You know, and here's a Mage, and it's just a Mage. Vary the way they play with the talent system as well. Maybe that would be better. I don't think it's a situation they can go to, because people will be up in arms, wouldn't they? Because it would be a massive change. Absolutely massive change. Last question, or statement, I should say, sorry. It says, Blizzard should balance design a bit more for melee. Range will always be in high demand. I do sort of agree with this, really. I can understand, in terms of, you know, they should think about fights in terms of melee. So what we're going to get the melee to do, instead of just putting mechanics in that you know are going to screw over melee and mean that you're going to basically need range to deal with them. And it's a very... You know, whenever you just come up with a situation, I've said, where you just go, okay, well, it's not possible for melee to deal with that mechanic, so we'll just have it only affect ranged and healers. That'll be all right. That'll work out. That's just lazy design. You really need, if range are going to have to deal with something, you need something for melee to deal with. I mean, the fight that always brings me in mind that was actually seemed to be well designed from a melee range point of view was Ironcon in MOP, Throne of Thunder. That was a pretty good fight because you wanted a nice balance of melee and ranged, the way that fight worked. So that was pretty good. That sort of thinking, I think, should apply to every fight where it's not going to naturally occur. You should never be encouraged to take an imbalance of either melee or range. If you have to have an imbalance, it obviously should be for melee because there's far more melee classes than range classes. You know, there are 9 classes that can play melee DPS as opposed to 6 for ranged. And when you look at, it's even worse when you look at the ones where you've got no choice. You know, there are 6 classes that can only play melee DPS. They have no ranged option. That's half of all the classes. Whereas ranged classes, there's only 3 that have to be ranged. And then you've got another 3 classes that can have ranged and melee access. But yeah, I do think they should consciously think about the design to encourage it. Because it is Blizzard's fault this has occurred. I can understand why it wasn't in the beginning. Because in the beginning, your melee DPS was basically rogues. Okay? Warriors could do really good damage. The problem is that hardly anyone knew how to play Fury Warrior. So, I mean, we had one in our guild. But most guilds didn't have one at all. And you probably didn't have more than one that knew how to play Fury DPS well. So, generally speaking, your warriors were your tanks. And and your paladins, I mean, good luck trying to keep up DPS rotation whilst buffing 40 people every 5 minutes. The only way you got to do decent damage was when you didn't have to do that. That came much later in vanilla. Or if your guild let you off blessing duty, but then that's just weakening the whole guild. So, by and large, your melee DPS were rogues. And but now, the majority of classes are melee DPS. The majority of DPS are melee DPS. So they should really factor that into their design thinking. I just don't think they are. I've never even heard them talk about it. They just brush it off whenever it's brought up as an issue. But I do think, I agree that I do think these fights should be designed with that in mind. If ever you come up with a design where someone's going to say, do you know what? People are going to attempt as much as possible to bring all their ranged, even their crap ranged players, over their decent melee, because that's just the nature of the fight. At that point, that should be a huge warning bell that sounds in that design team that goes, right, we need to do something about this then. And it doesn't. They don't do that. So, that's the last one. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and until next time, I'll see you later.